Nation's going to rename it the Fit and Feasibility Tool. We have always called it the hexagon because it has six spots, and we're not a very creative group, and so we were like, we'll call it that. And we've called it that for so long. But we recently relaunched it in June, so about 6 months ago at our Summer Institute down in Chapel Hill on implementation science. And we relaunched it with an eye towards two things: who it is that we involve in assessing these domains, and how does contextual fit really support a focus on equity and inclusion, and in particular, racial and ethnic equity and inclusion when we're making choices. So we had some support to do that. We are usability testing this now. So I'll talk about what some of the changes are to it, but this is open source, as all of our work is. So if you go to our website, you can see the new version has a completely new scoring tool that goes with it, where you're essentially rating each of these domains on a 1 to 5 scale, like how usable is something, what capacity do we have the capacity to actually pull it off, that kind of thing. And what's been really interesting for us is, even though this is something we often use during an early phase of work, we use it retrospectively with a lot of interventions that were not sustained, to try and see if we could see some patterns in fit challenges. So I'll tell you what those patterns are in just a second. But one of the changes we made to it is we divided these 6 indicators into the green and the blue. And the reason that was so critical is because the green ones are out of our control. They're about the program or practice itself. So a program or practice has a level of evidence, right? It comes with a certain amount of supports if you choose to purchase it or use it. And it's been defined, because it's not something you're defining. Someone else defined it, and you've decided you want to use it. So these are things that are inherent in the program or practice itself. But when we look at evidence, we're trying to take a really close look at under what conditions and with what population was the evidence initially developed. We're huge proponents of primary source information, because research summaries are often marketing tools. And so it's really, really helpful to go back to primary source and have a deeper understanding of where is the evidence really developed. We take a look at the supports that come with it. So if you are to select this, we actually know from the field of implementation science which you'll need to be able to sustain it. We already know that. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And so we want to know, does the program come with that? So is this something you can sustain, or is it like one-time training? And then when you have a lot of turnover, you got to wait 6 months to get trained again? Is there a fidelity assessment that's actually usable? Can it be integrated into your data system? Do they help you figure out kind of buy-in around this? So it's kind of getting a sense of, like, what does it come with? And then the last is, how usable is it? So is it a set of principles? Principles are a good thing, but they're not that usable. Right? So we want to get a sense of, what does day-to-day practice look like? What would I look for to know that something was child-centered? What would I look for to know that something was data-driven? What would I have to see and hear to know that that was actually happening? And if something is not defined at that level, the less usable it actually becomes. And when something's not usable, it's not sustainable. So something we take a really close look at. But again, those are fairly easy to rate in some ways, because they're just about the program or practice. It's the blue indicators that are harder, because if you think about it, the blue is need. To be able to tell whether a program or practice meets the need that you have to do 2 things. You have to know what your need is, but then the program or practice has to say what need it meets. A lot of programs or practices are kind of general. Like, this can be used with, families who have, experienced substance abuse challenges. But are they the same as your families? It's trying to get a sense of, does it meet your specific need? You need to know both of those things to be able to rate the need piece on this. And you'd see that if you kind of download the tool, how that works. We talk a lot about root cause analysis. So there's accompanying pieces that kind of help people go through a needs assessment process. We look at fit. So this is to say, if I were to select this program or practice, is it a good fit with my community's values, history, priorities, culture? These are things that we want to get a really good sense of. Fit is a massive issue around the sustainability piece. And then finally, capacity. Do we have what's needed to pull this off? Do we have the staffing structure? Do we have the finances? Do we have the technology? We never let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You're never going to get all 5s on these 6. But one pattern that we've seen with the lack of sustainability are high green scores and low blue scores, which means it was a fabulous program or practice. We did this with a lot of teen pregnancy prevention models that were used in rural areas. The same could be said for home visiting. And the challenge was sustaining them in under-resourced areas. And what we saw was there was nothing wrong with the program or practice. Highly evidence-based, really usable, came with a lot of supports, but it didn't match up with community values. I mean, we had teen pregnancy prevention programs that were about condom use being taught in the 7th grade when the 6th grade curriculum was about abstinence. It's a low fit score, right? And so there's kind of this idea of how it is that we make those selections. So again, nothing's perfect here. I'd probably say I've been asked before too, what are the kind of do or die indicators on this? I'd say for the green, it's usability. You can't implement something that's not at least defined enough to give it a go. And on the blue, it's about need. If it doesn't meet the need of your population, then it's not worth trying to increase fit or build capacity. But if you score high on those 2, it might be worth taking it on, and then you go in and you try and strengthen the other pieces. Okay. This middle piece around this aligned infrastructure. So if we think about the fact that you've gone through your contextual fit analysis, you've made a selection, potentially around a recruitment or retention practice that you want to use, you then have to ask these questions. What supports are needed for practitioners to do the practice well? And who needs support? Whose practice are we changing for what purpose? So is it recruitment and retention specialists that are specifically doing that work in some agencies? Is it foster care case planners? Is it community partners? Is it parent advocates? Like, whose practice are you changing? And that's a really important question to ask, because that's the concept of an aligned infrastructure. If you just change someone's practice in a certain role, but you don't change the practice of the roles surrounding them, then you lack alignment. So we often kind of ask about who are primary actors, secondary actors, tertiary actors. Do they all need the same type of support? That kind of thing, and really getting a sense of that. I'm just going to walk you through this for, you always have that clever animation and then you don't actually want it, you just kind of move through it quickly. But if you were to think about what's really needed to change practice, we know that it's how we hire folks. And I'm going to kind of match this up with your CHAMPS toolkit in a second. How we train them and how we coach them. That's what allows us to get to stronger fidelity at the top. It's also about how we use data to support our decision making. It's about our administrative practices. That's your leadership. And it's about systems interventions. That's your collaborative work, right? That's your shared and transparent and collaborative work with your community partners. So if you think about it, let me put my glasses on. You're selecting for important characteristics such as individuals who hold a value that child-centered work is critical. So you're selecting on what you need someone to be able to implement later. You want to build their capacity to not only recruit and retain, but if you look through the toolkit, to engage and support, to communicate, to share, to collaborate, to use data. You want to coach them to ensure that after they've received that training that you know alone won't work, you coach them on each of the skills that you hired them on and train them on. That's the other piece of alignment. What you hire for is what you train on. What you train on is what you coach to support. And it's those same pieces that you then assess fidelity on. So if you want child-centered work that's data-driven, that's collaborative and transparent, then you have to assess fidelity to those domains. That's what you hired someone to do, trained and coached them to do well, and you assess their fidelity. You're able to do that by using data, and that data then has to be linked to those practices to know whether they're being implemented as intended. You identify how agencies and leaders at child welfare, leaders and managers at child welfare agencies and nonprofit partners support practitioners. Again, who's your who? Who are they supporting? Are they supporting recruitment and retention specialists? Are they supporting foster care case planners? But leaders have to know who they're charged in supporting for what. And then they can create procedures, policies, and processes to make sure those folks are being supported. And then finally, who are you engaging? So what do your systems interventions look like to ensure authentic collaborative partnerships and bi-directional communication? So that's your infrastructure, and specifically as it would relate to those principles around effective recruitment and retention. And then finally, if we think about that last bit, that enabling context, just want to mention two things here. We're doing okay, I think, with the pace, right? So we have 10 to 15 minutes for Q, and I have till 2:15, and it's 2:02. I don't think that's really bad. That it could be like so much worse. I can't even tell you like what biggest. But when you were doing the slides, I started to rush a little. So now I just want to pause for 1 second. Did that feel really rushed when I went through the triangle, or it felt okay? You were following along. I mean, it's amazing how alert you guys all look after lunch. That's so great. Makes me happy. Okay, so, and you get that. You get this idea because I think so much of, like, we have all these buzzwords, and that's what I want to demystify, like this idea, like we always talk about alignment, you know, and hopefully I was just giving you some examples of what is that? You know, you have to, there's who's in all of this, people in all of this. And so you have to know who are your actors and what are you aligning them to do? And then you need to build an infrastructure. It doesn't have to be that driver's triangle, by the way. It could be in, you know, whatever. There's infrastructure elements. You guys know how to lead work. But it's this idea of leading with that in each planning meeting. And when you're collecting data, you not only want to collect data on those practices, you want to collect data on those drivers I just showed you in the triangle. How is our hiring working for child-centered, data-driven practitioners? You know, how is our training working for child-centered, data-driven practitioners, right? That's what you want to be able to do. So for me, like the gift of that driver's triangle it's not telling you anything you don't already know. I don't think there's anyone in this room that wouldn't like think of all those things on your own anyway. It just gives you a framework to talk about it and to ensure that when you're agenda setting, you have a really clear, visible infrastructure. Visible, okay? If we think about that last bit, this work has to be done through teams. This is where, first of all, there's a lot of beautiful data just in the last 5 years. A lot of it comes out of public education and the movement away from kind of solo leaders these kind of models of like superintendents, district leaders being able to kind of make, really these kind of solo decisions in service to, getting to better outcomes for their students. But really what we've come to learn is the problems we face are complicated and the systems we work in are complex, and no single person holds the diversity of perspectives that's needed to accurately plan and to accurately troubleshoot and to accurately interpret data. Because if you gave me a data chart, told me a little case study, gave me data, I could tell you what the data means and says. I mean, I've been trained to do that. Anyone else in this room would give a slightly different story. And then other people may give a pretty different story. And that's why we're such a huge proponent of teams. It's not just about building capacity. It's about the fact that the work doesn't get done well if you don't have these multiple perspectives. This is where we've made a pretty big change in our work in terms of who is on a team. And again, thinking about how do we have lived experience? How do we involve families in ways that are not tokenistic and are actually true engagement? So a huge piece of this work is that we will never do another focus group unless we have full buy-in that when we summarize the data, it goes back to the people that participated in the group to tell us whether that's what they said. So it's unbelievable how we do half the loop all the time. We gather information, and then as experts, we pull that back into the system. And really what's happening is we're not doing a check on those who participated by saying, yeah, you interpreted these themes in the way I remember in that group. And it's that kind of work that's so critical to how we gather information and how we create our teaming structures. So you'll see here, kind of talk about the different composition that's critical for our teaming structures. Everyone might not sit on the same team, by the way. We might have kind of a multiple teaming structure. So we ask people, when you have teams and you're doing this work, do you have a diversity in position and perspective? Do you have leadership on the team, and does leadership support the team? And does the team understand what it's charged with doing? So I gave you an example of what that can look like around recruitment and retention practices. Oftentimes in child welfare systems, there's a governance structure that helps support any new initiative. You're always going back to governance to kind of talk things through. But you might have a cross-division foster parent support team, and then maybe you have teams that come from that are based on your nonprofit service provider network, your workforce institute, those who are hired specifically as specialists in this area, your community advocate or partners and advocates. And what happens is representatives from each of those teams that are charged with pieces of the work come together on that cross-division team. And that's what then gets fed up. That's what's called a linked teaming structure, because you often can't get something done, but you have to have overlap among people. And finally, that's what would support your linked communication. So when you form those linked teams, you're then able to figure out who needs to talk to who about what and how often. So that visual representation is what will give you the collaborative, transparent, and shared principle that you've written about in the toolkit. And I'm just going to end there. Leave that slide up just to have something up. Thank you.
Questions? I'll start with a question.
Go for it.
Do you have an example of somebody who's applied this to their... I have trouble with microphones. Do you have an example of someone who's applied this approach to their intervention and improved performance?
Yeah, so we released a brief with Casey Family Programs last year on our work in, we have a lot of examples, but this one's a beautiful one in New York City. So New York City converted a third of their treatment slots and preventive services to evidence-based models, starting about 6 years ago, maybe 7 years ago. And we use this entire approach. So the contextual fit analysis, the driver's piece, working its way through. And we've been able to sustain those models now into year 7, and that has yielded child level outcomes on their preventive side.
Was that child first?
No, it was not under child first. So it's interesting. I mean, we've used this approach in a lot of different child welfare districts, jurisdictions and states, and, have been able to make it to population level change. And I think about 3 that I'm really thinking of now, meaning they were longer term engagements. The New York work, we were engaged for about 3.5 years in that work, which, and honestly, in the scheme of things, it's the blink of an eye. Because to really do this change takes a long time. And they've really shifted a lot of what they do to be able to accommodate for the create that enabling context. They use a teaming structure, a linked teaming structure. They create a sustainability team. We live through 4 commissioners, which I think is, But what I like to do is that retrospective when we haven't gotten to outcomes. So often what we'll get to are systems change outcomes. Then we'll get to practice outcomes, but it's the child outcomes you want, and they take a few years. And we all know we can name the 20 things that derail getting to child outcomes. So when we have the things that stick, so that infrastructure piece I told you about, making something visible, that is the keys to the kingdom. Because if you start to change job descriptions and you start to essentially put protocols in place that are written down somewhere, that usually withstands an administration change. It's the visibility of it that we got out front on, the visibility of the infrastructure, not the practice. Practice everyone's trying to get buy-in for. We're trying to get buy-in for the infrastructure, and that's a little bit of a difference.
Other questions? Yes.
So I was interested to hear your description of FIT.
Yeah.
We're from all over the country, obviously, and we're just about to get a menu of services for evidence-based practices for families first prevention.
Yes.
That are supposed to fit across the country.
Yes.
Do you have any guidance or suggestions?
I know. I was going to say, are we on video or
No.
I don't know what's happening. I know. I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah.
No, I'm not trying to trap you.
Yeah.
So we're doing what we're supposed to do. We're creating locally, for me, a sustainability team. We're going to start looking at what our existing contracts look like. How can we start aligning
Sure, yes.
what we do
Yes.
with what's going to be coming?
Yes.
But do you have any other suggestions about how we could move forward? Because it's neighborhood by neighborhood or area, but 5 different districts in our county, and all of them profess to have a very different culture and a very different way of supporting families. So just perhaps if you could talk a little bit about how to make this whole thing work.
Yeah, so I know what you mean is you're going across, and so the idea of contextual fit is often fit for a place and a population, and that could be different across a really large state. I think this is where the difference between program and practice will be really helpful. So first of all, that list is really short now, right? I think it's like 12 things on the list, and it's my understanding is it's a rolling list, and things will be added. My other understanding is that states can make a case for being able to claim something as reimbursable that might not be on that list. Is that correct? Yeah. So what we want to do, so we're working with some states now, is 2 things, is to lift up the concept of practice, because practices are different than manualized programs. It's not to say that some of the manualized programs on that list, MST, FFT, would not be a good fit with some of what you're doing. They've been replicated a lot and I think do have a lot of evidence. But there's other things on that list like MI, right? That's a practice. That's not a program. And so it's starting, what we want to do is take a look at and what are the practices that undergird a lot of the programs that allow a defensible practice model that's reimbursable by states. And so that's something where we can start to, I think, take a close look at. I wish Jerry was here to comment more on that. I'm not an expert on the legislation, but I do think that there are opportunities there to kind of lead with core components and practices that you might be able to make a case for. I think it's also about shared infrastructure. So like that work in New York City, they had 12 evidence-based models because they instituted them by, and you know that their story, because we've talked about it a lot, but by level of risk. So they had kind of low risk, moderate risk, high risk, extremely high risk. That's how they picked, that's why they had so many models. They differentiate their families by risk and protective factors, and then they were aligned with a certain evidence-based model, and then in a borough, out of the 5 boroughs that it was available in. Okay, so that was essentially how they did that. So it's to say that you can implement a lot of EBPs, actually, that might meet pockets of work you have. It's just then at the agency level developing a shared infrastructure for those EBPs. So 2 examples of that is that they changed policy at their agency to support that rollout, and they also created a workforce development institute that allowed for training and support on things like fidelity to any of the models. Does that make sense? And so they were creating an infrastructure that allowed for some flexibility and borough-level rollout of different evidence-based practices. So there's an ability to do that as well.
Okay, one more quick question and then a fairly quick answer if you can do it.
Sure. Oh, okay.
Good. Go ahead.
I'll try to get it to work. So, we've talked before.
Yes.
So I think, and, we hosted a site visit from New York related
Yes.
to one of our practices and
Yes.
learned a lot about what they were doing with this particular practice. And like for us to do something like that is a good example, I think, of the approach you're illustrating. Is like for us to do that, we'd have to realign even how we handle hotline calls and assessment.
Sure.
Those are all those system things,
Yeah.
right? I think what I'd like you to speak to for a minute, it's a little bit the conversation we've been having, because one of the traps of Family First is that the prevention side, at least right now, is a very defined set of programs, right? And they're in only for certain areas, right? So it's not the universe, it's just a starting point, as Jerry would say. But that's very different than implementing a whole system approach. For instance, none of those programs address some of the most important work of child welfare, which is the initial engagement with families.
Yes.
Which speaks to Jerry's story about how you have these reports over and over again and we can't engage the family and then something really bad. So how do you see maybe implementation science maybe coexisting with or supporting where Family First wants to go? Because I think Jerry would say Family First, that's just like a starting point. If you read some of his other stuff, the bigger vision is really this whole system, right? So how do you see implementation science helping with that? Because in some ways, people are going to have to also navigate not just throwing programs at families too, because they can be paid for. So can you speak to that a little bit?
I think it'd be great if we could, as a field, be able to really look at that concept of alignment along with the FFA legislation. So to basically, so Jerry was talking about it being a part of a larger conceptual vision. And so, yes, it goes to first engagement with family. It goes to actually investigative work and thinking about the fact that some of those practices that would be reimbursable under preventive are absolutely appropriate for investigative work as well, like MI, safety planning. I think they kind of fall into both of those things, right? So it's starting to think about how do we, and so I've been asking around for, because we have some work we're doing with the Andy Casey Foundation on this, for partners, public agencies that want to partner with us on mapping out a regular, their business process, essentially. And then being able to say, how would Family First align with that? Even though you're just being reimbursed for these particular services or practices, which ones of those would you want to use in more than one place in the system to create that alignment and coherence? I was just about to make up a word there. And then how is it that you create an infrastructure that's in service to that? And so I have these kind of fantasies in my head of being able to do some business mapping processes with folks, and then be able to then align that with implementation science. So what does that look like in terms of sequencing and infrastructure? And I think that's where we would need to go. Because right now, the legislation does have some bounds to it, but I think there's some provocative ways to look at how investigations can be claimable.
And also, the compliance saying, okay, now we're only going to do those
Sure thing, sure thing.
on the list, then that wouldn't necessarily be fit, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. Thank you so much.
Allison, thank you so much for
Thank you.
coming.
Thank you.
Okay, we're on.
Can I just ask, are those slides going to be made available to us by chance?
Yeah, I sent them in, and you can have them in the PowerPoint.
I think we're going to make all of them available, right?
Yeah, after the conference, when you go back home, we'll send a link that has everything in it.
Yeah. Okay, so everything that's shown here on the screen will be available after the conference. Okay, we're on break until 2:30.
Jerry said it, how it fits into the larger conceptual vision, but I think for a lot of states, we're talking to very simple. And then it's thinking about the fact that they want to do so 50% health support interventions that aren't, aligned. So the legislature's a phenomenal opportunity. It's just we need to, so we need like public agency partners to do this work.
Well, I don't know, maybe.